August 7th, 1943. The phrase from Psalm 44, "Nay, but for thy sake are we killed all the day. We are accounted as sheep to be slaughtered," is often used to paraphrase the perception that Jews went passively to their death in the Holocaust, implying a certain responsibility on the victims to not have resisted enough. In the Tachanun prayer, the supplication, it gets a more appropriate context, expressing the perseverance of faith of the Jews despite constant persecution. "Look from heaven and perceive that we have become an object of scorn and derision among the nations. We are regarded as the sheep led to slaughter, to be killed, destroyed, beaten, and humiliated. But despite all this, we have not forgotten your name. We beg you not to forget us." This week, in the death factory at Treblinka, hundreds of Jewish men prove the perception of meekness wrong, take God's work in their own hands, securing that the suffering of 1 million of their brothers and sisters will not be forgotten by fighting back against their Nazi persecutors. This is the little-known Treblinka uprising. Here's a word from the Time Ghost Army.
Never forget. Never give up. Never surrender. Join the Time Ghost Army.
This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus, Olsson. Last week, we saw Mussolini being ousted as dictator of Italy following military failures in the bombing of Rome. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Force engineered a firestorm in Hamburg, leaving the city burnt out, displacing over 1 million, wounding tens of thousands, and killing 37,000 civilians, Allied POW, and forced laborers. In Bengal, British India, the colonial government cracked down on the massive amount of vagrant beggars arising from rampant inflation and growing starvation. As this week begins, Reichspropaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels holds a speech in Berlin, announcing that the capital shall be largely evacuated to avoid a disaster like in Hamburg, with other cities to follow. The news creates confusion and panic, as it is unclear for who, when, and how these evacuations are meant. One of the few clear messages is that anyone who is not required for essential labor, with relations in the countryside, should look for shelter there. The day after the radio broadcast speech, the telephone calls out of Berlin rise from an average of 60,000 to 380,000. In the following days, some workers do not appear for work. Many working women seek leave on grounds of motherhood, which is granted, while others simply give notice. However, by the end of the week, the situation has stabilized. Essential workers remain at their posts, and people are leaving the city in an orderly fashion. The general mood in Germany after last week's firestorm and the collapse of the fascist government in Italy is reported by the SS as being tense and reminiscent of the Novemberstimmung of 1918, a mood based on fear of revolution, imminent defeat, and more hardships to come. While the SS report that doubt over Germany's capacity to win the war is on the rise and fear that the fate of Hamburg will befall more cities, it is the absence of equal retribution on British cities that causes the most distress. A feeling that the Nazi leadership is failing the people is on the rise, although the public blame is mostly assigned to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, rather than the Führer himself. Meanwhile, in London, it is a representative for the starving in Bengal who hopes for government assistance. On August 4th, British Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, presents a memorandum warning of the situation in Bengal to the War Cabinet. He notes that a starving population will have a negative impact on munition production in India and the safety of British troops stationed there. He asks that the monthly deliveries of 80,000 tons of food grains that Viceroy Linlithgow has long requested but never tried to enforce be shipped as soon as possible. That night, Amery notes in his diary that the War Cabinet meeting quickly goes in another direction than he had hoped. They are not open to honoring the Viceroy's request. Some cabinet ministers voice the opinion that it's mostly a bluff by the Indians and that hoarding is the actual problem. Furthermore, they argue that securing the ships and diverting food grains from newly occupied territories in Italy will be impossible. There simply aren't any transports available. It's not technically wrong. but is a question of priorities. The Western United Nations allies have a surplus of cargo ships now that the Battle of the Atlantic has more or less been won. Ships that are being used to create food stockpiles for future potential needs in the UK and the Middle East. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is part of the opposition. In his view, the greater danger is Indian uprisings for independence. A few weeks ago, he opined that Field Marshal of India Archie Wavell was creating a Frankenstein by putting modern weapons in the hands of sepoys, that the native troops might shoot us in the back, and then demanded that all Bengalis be purged from the Indian army. Despite Churchill's repeated request, that Wavell notes in his diary on July 27th that the Prime Minister hates India and everything to do with it, the Field Marshal hasn't carried through the requested purge. Enforcing Churchill's opposition to food aid in the War Cabinet is Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, also known as the Prof, who supported Bomber Command leader Arthur Harris to create the dehousing bombing policies against Germany. As Paymaster General on the cabinet, the Prof is in charge of anything that has to do with food supplies. He claims that it is a little hard that the UK, which has already suffered a greater drop in the standard of life than India, should be mulcted because the government of India cannot arrange its affairs in an orderly manner. Ultimately, the War Cabinet doesn't find a decision on monthly shipments, but promises Amory 30,000 tons of grain from Australia and 100,000 from Iraq. On receiving the news, outgoing Viceroy of India Linlithgow, who himself has claimed repeatedly that hoarding is the real problem, exclaims that I cannot be responsible for the stability of India now. Too little or not, the promised food isn't coming anyway. A Ministry of War Transport memo reveals that the War Cabinet Directive of August 4 is not a precise instruction, as no decision is taken whether any wheat is in fact to go to India, and no time limit is laid down beyond the implication that the requirements of Ceylon and the Middle East for cereals are to receive priority. While starvation continues to spread in Bengal, some Indians still hope for help from Japan to gain independence. This week, we see how that might play out when Japan grants independence to occupied Burma. The Japanese have been dangling actual sovereignty in front of the Burmese nationalists' noses since invasion last year, 1942. More than a year later, they have not delivered, instead imposing a military exploitative occupation with massive seizures of resources and the slave labor program we have seen at work on the Burma Railroad. Now, as the tides of war are turning against them, the Japanese express a need to gain more popular support in their empire. So, on August 1st, 1943, the military administration is put to an end. Dr. Ba Ma, already head of state of occupied Burma, becomes the head of state of independent Burma. Here's the thing, though. With the Declaration of Independence, the Japanese forced Burma into 3 new agreements, including a treaty of alliance and a secret military agreement. The wording is of military, economic, and political cooperation, but from the conditions, it's clear that the Burmese are far from being their own masters. Japanese advisors are included in all important government offices. Japanese forces can requisite labor, buildings, and resources as they please, and Japan can continue to exercise authority over infrastructure, press censorship, police, and government appointments. While no relief from murderous exploitation is in sight for the Burmese, the same is true for those under the charge of the Nazi German Reich. On August 4th, the formal decision comes to use concentration camp prisoner slave labor at the Peenemünde German V2 rocket plant. Germany is quite literally running out of unskilled laborers for assembly work, or at least anyone they're ready to put to this kind of work. Despite what Arthur Harris and Bomber Command hoped, it's not an effective bombing German cities. It's their own war effort that is bleeding them dry. Putting German women to work is still frowned upon, and the German men are either serving the Wehrmacht, wounded, taken prisoner, or dead. To replace their massive frontline casualties, the Wehrmacht has lowered the health and physical requirements and extended the age bracket for conscription and began transferring personnel from the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe to the Heer, the land army. Neither has that been enough, nor has the increased recruitment of foreign volunteers. Finally, this summer, they resort to combing the concentration camps for criminals and those deemed antisocial, who, although in camps, are not ideologically viewed as enemies of the German race and can be pressed together into penal battalions. The rest of the concentration camp inmates have effectively been transformed into a slave labor pool administered by the SS at the disposal for war production. It is then that Generalmajor Walter Dornberger, in charge of the rocket program on the side of the Wehrmacht, refers to on August 4th when he notes that, as a basic principle, production in all 4 assembly works will be carried out by convicts. Peenemünde will receive 2,500 concentration camp prisoners immediately, mainly Jewish men and women deemed fit for labor until dead instead of immediate murder, many just teenagers. For every non-Jewish German employee, there will eventually be at least 10 to 15 camp inmates supplied by the SS. To fill the ranks of the SS slave columns, any remaining ghettos continue to be liquidated. Although also forced laborers and also held in work camps, the ghetto inhabitants exist under the pretense of employment. It's of course without choice, and remuneration is below any definition of a poverty line. But they do have marginal autonomy, comparatively speaking. As we have seen, per Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler's orders, that shall now end. In the area around Vilnius, in June and July 1943, the German Sicherheitspolizei has been liquidating several work camps like Białawaka, Kene, Bezdany, and Nowa Wielka. On August 1st, around 3,000 Jewish forced laborers from the Vilna main ghetto are fired from their workplaces outside of the ghetto. Now, you might remember that under pressure from the inhabitants fearing liquidation, resistance leader Yitzhak Wittenberg turned himself in to appease the SS and then committed suicide in prison. With the firings, anxiety of a full-out liquidation spreads again. Jakob Gens, head of the Jewish Council of the Ghetto, tries to reassure everyone that it is not the beginning of the end. It is to no avail, and rumors of deportation continue to spread. On June 5th, several workers still employed refuse to leave the ghetto to go to their workplaces. They're arrested by the Jewish ghetto police, but they're soon let free to avoid an uprising. The next day, as several thousand leave for work, thousands of them are surrounded and abducted by Estonian soldiers and SS. Some resist, but facing overwhelming firepower, most are apprehended and 20 are killed on the spot. The captured Jews are taken to the Estonian concentration camp Vaivara, where they are put to work. It reinforces the conviction that the worst to come is right around the corner, but the general attitude remains the same as it was before. For now, no one is willing to trade uncertain life for certain death. At the extermination factory Treblinka, a group of men think differently. Since July 1942 until now, August 1943, 870,000 men, women, children, and infants have been murdered by gas here, sometimes at a rate of 20,000 a day. Mainly Jews from the Generalgouvernement in occupied Poland, but also over 100,000 Jews from the Bialystok district, about 30,000 Jews from other parts of Europe, and about 2,000 Roma and Sinti. With almost all Jews in Poland murdered, and the new labor programs taking the lead, industrial murder is now to be concentrated to Auschwitz II, Birkenau, and Treblinka is set to close. The buildings will be razed, the ground will be plowed, so that a farm will hide the sinister scars of the atrocities committed here. Roughly 870 Jewish workers have been kept alive to run the SS camp. With the end approaching, they rightly fear that they are to be the last victims to die in Treblinka's gas chambers. Since early this year, a group led by Sev Kurland, the eldest prisoner worker, Cyril Bloch, a Czech army officer, and Adolf Friedman of Łódź, who served in the French Foreign Legion, have been organizing for an uprising. Their first attempt at bribing the non-German auxiliary guards using money siphoned off of what the SS had been stealing from their victims failed earlier this year when their co-conspirator,
Jewish medical doctor in charge of the camp's hospital, Julian Chorążycki,
was caught in the act and committed suicide to avoid giving away his fellow prisoners under torture. The instigators continued plotting, now with the aid of a senior inmate, engineer Alfred Galewski, and military expertise from Rudolf Masaryk, a Christian lieutenant in the Czech army who elected to accompany his pregnant Jewish wife when she was deported from Theresienstadt to Treblinka, where she and their unborn child were murdered on arrival. Over the spring, the instigators forged a plan to organize an armed uprising in the two separate inmate camps, the lower and upper camp, simultaneously. While Bloch and Friedman take care of organizing activities in the upper camp, Galewski takes the overall lead from the lower camp and begins to recruit the core operatives. One of them is carpenter Jankiel Wiernik, taken to Treblinka in August 1942 as part of the Grosse Aktion in the Warsaw Ghetto. We began to organize into groups of 5, each group being assigned a specific task, such as wiping out the German and Ukrainian garrisons, setting the buildings on fire, covering the escape of the inmates, etc. All the necessary paraphernalia was being prepared: blunt tools to kill our keepers, lumber for the construction of bridges, gasoline for setting fires, etc. The date for starting the revolt was set for June 15, but the 0 hour was postponed several times and new dates were set because the time was not yet ripe. On August 2nd, at 4:30 p.m., it will be that time. It's a hot summer day, and Camp Commandant Franz Stangl, 4 SS and 16 foreign volunteer guards have gone for a swim in the nearby Bug River. After their noon break, the conspirators begin to prepare in silence. One prisoner, Ruben Lubrensky, in charge of repairs on the SS motor pool, sabotages the engine of the garrison's armored car, while others distribute wire cutters and axes he has taken from his shop. The SS guard watching over the armory is lured away, and they steal a few pistols, a few dozen hand grenades, and 15 rifles. They're handed out slowly by packing them with building materials or foodstuffs that have to be transported through the camp. Meanwhile, another prisoner whose job it is to douse the barracks with disinfectants does his usual rounds, but today his tank is filled with gasoline. Until 3:30 p.m., all goes well, but then one SS guard, Oberscharführer Kuttner, is seen talking briefly to a known informant. When he seizes a passing-by young Jew who happens to be carrying a sizable amount of cash for the escape, Galewski fears that the game is up. He decides to send out one of the men to shoot Kuttner and launch the uprising a half hour early. His hope is that the shot will alert Bloch and Friedman to also start early in the upper camp. The gun goes off at 4 p.m. and Kuttner falls to the ground. The signal is understood, and in both camps the inmates spring into action, attacking predetermined targets. Ruben Lubrensky sets fire to the gasoline depot but is killed in the process. Others bombard the headquarters with grenades or storm the guard towers. More join, armed with whatever they can get their hands on, shovels, pitchforks, and guns from the armories. They come together to storm the guards and get through the fence. Many of them are mown down by machine guns, but close to half of them, over 400, make it out alive. Among the 350 fallen prisoners are Bloch, Friedman, Galewski, Masaryk, and Kurland. 300 of the escapees will be caught or turned in by anti-Semitic Poles, but over 100 get away, many helped by sympathetic Poles.
Among them are one survivor, Jerzy Rajgrodzki.
At dawn we stopped in a forest, and there we remained throughout the day, hiding in the bushes. We were about a dozen kilometers from the camp. We heard screams from far away. They must have been the screams of Jews caught by the Germans. The day passed, and at nightfall we resumed our march. After several days' walk, we passed near Siedlce and finally reached Warsaw. Many of the escapees will join the resistance or partisans and continue fighting. When the war ends, around 70 of them will still be alive. In the camp, Kuttner is injured but alive, and an unknown number, but at least half a dozen guards are dead. When Camp Commandant Stangl returns to his blazing camp, he orders the execution of any surviving or captured prisoners, leaving only the 100 weakest inmates alive to work until the camp closes at the end of the month, several weeks ahead of schedule. The camp will then be covered up as planned, as will the uprising of August 2nd. By then, So lethal has Treblinka been that the escaped prisoners are not only the only surviving victims of this day's events, but the only people deported to Treblinka at all to live to tell the tale and keep the memory of the fallen alive. Without them, the grueling last moments of countless human beings would be nothing but numbers and names in the rosters of the Nazi death machine. But thanks to the brave men of this day, they are more. They are an army of the dead who inspired a struggle for freedom under near hopeless conditions. So survives the details of the final suffering of close to 1 million innocent people as a cautionary tale against the hatred that killed them. Never forget.